Let's get started here. Okay.
I thought that I would do a prayer. It's a Catholic prayer in a way, but in a way it's not. I think it's a very interfaith prayer, and it's kind of timely, and that's prayer of St. Francis, because his feast day was just last week. There are so many versions of it, so bear with me, because I'm just doing it by heart. Make me an instrument of your peace. When there's hatred, let me so love. Where there's injury, your pardon, Lord, and when there's doubt, faith in you. Make me an instrument of your peace. For it is in pardoning that we are pardoning. It is in dying that we are born to eternal life. And the rest of the prayer I can't remember. Last week, I thought of that because last week we had a presentation. In fact, Reinhard Krauss was the facilitator of a movie called The Saint and the Sultan. And it was about St. Francis being the Sultan of Egypt. And it spoke so much about dialogue, understanding among religions that was really exemplified magnificently by those two individuals. And as I was watching that, I said, you know, this is what we've strived to do in Don Unity over the years. And I just thought this time it's appropriate we should begin with that.
In 1999, at a conference next door at the Mary and Joseph Retreat Center, Msgr. Royal Vatican proposed on the Jubilee year forthcoming for a Catholic celebration that they have a march from the Mary and Joseph Retreat Center to Congregation near Tamid and present a gift of unbreakable glass on the anniversary of Kristallnacht. That became the Kristallnacht event, which led into what we're doing tonight in the interfaith work that we have been doing in Palos Verdes. And Msgr. Vatican had been doing this for a long time, particularly with Rabbi Wolf of the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and created the priest-rabbi dialogue and many publications and things. We lost Msgr. Vatican last month, and we are very appreciative for the life that he led and the gifts that he gave us. So I think we should appropriately have a few seconds of silence in his name, in memory.
Allow me to conclude with a Catholic prayer on his behalf.
Sure.
And those of you who know should know the responses. The Catholics, the rest, join in, please. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord. May he rest in peace. May his soul and the souls of all the faithfully departed to the mercy of God rest in peace.
We tonight are celebrating his legacy, and very proud to be doing so. Let me introduce the rest of the panel. You have just met Msgr. Sork, who is the pastor here at St. John Fisher. Next to him is Rabbi Mark Diamond, who is at Loyola Marymount in the Jewish Studies program. And then we have Professor Amir Hussain, who is also at Loyola Marymount. Reverend Reinhard Krauss, who has been in this community for many years and is the head of the Jewish, Christian, Muslim Affairs Studies Academy. Thank you. I got started okay. That's fine. And I'm Bob Rothman. Welcome all. Before we begin our program, there's something of interest that we'd like to share with you. We are beginning our 18th year of the Don Unity Group. And 18 is a very important number for Jews in the Jewish tradition. And I want Rabbi Diamond to please explain the importance of 18 to us.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello? There we go. Thank you, Bob. Let me begin by thanking our gracious host, Msgr. Sork, my fellow panelists, Reverend Krauss and Professor Hussain. Bob, thanks to you and congratulations to you and this community on the 18th year of the Dawn Interfaith Discovery Series. As Bob mentioned, 18 is a good Jewish number. It's an odd number, but why is 18 a good number? It signifies good luck. In the Jewish tradition, Hebrew letters all have corresponding numerical values. So Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is of course 1, Bet is 2, and so on. Well, Yud is 10 in Hebrew, and Chet, the letter Chet, is the 8th letter, so 10 and 8 makes 18. If you reverse those in Hebrew, you get the Hebrew word Chai for life. So 18 is a very propitious Jewish number. Bob, my hope and prayer for you and for this series is that you'll have at least another 18 years of successful programming. I would also note that in Jewish tradition, 120 is a lucky number because, according to the Bible, Moses lived to 120. Bob, for you with inflation, may it be 130.
And you're all invited to my birthday party, too. Well, tonight we're going to talk about the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2. We're not going to get into the Garden of Eden. We'll save that for another time. But Genesis 1 and 2 is the creation of the world and everything that is in it. It's where you get started. And I thought that we should begin by having an understanding of the vacuum in which the story came. What were the traditions for creation of the world from the countries and cultures neighboring Israel back in the Iron Age? And Professor Hussain is going to give us a walkthrough of that, please.
Good evening, and thanks again to Msgr. Sork for hosting us. And as somebody who knew Msgr. Vatican, it's a huge loss, for us, the kind of work that he did. And so thanks, Bob, for that, the words of his memory. I'm going to say something about, shameless plug, this is my new textbook. I'm not asking you to go out and buy it. I'm going to read from it so you know what it is. World Religions, Western Traditions. The chapter on religions of antiquity was written by Michael de Roche, and Michael did his PhD at UCLA in the 60s, looking at the Gilgamesh story, taught for years at Dominguez Hills. He's retired, but he's still teaching at Dominguez Hills, because he loves the teaching. And so there's no one creation story in these traditions. One of the things they have in common is there isn't, not to preempt what we're going to talk about in Genesis, there's no creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. Different stories, different traditions. And so in the Babylonian, for example, some of you may be familiar with the Gilgamesh epic. In the Babylonian creation story, it's the god Marduk who slays the dragon Tiamat, and out of this dragon creates heaven and earth. And one of the things Michael talks about in the book, or in the chapter, is that you tend to have that sort of tripartite thing of the world, that there's a heaven, there's an earth, and there's some kind of netherworld, some space where the dead are. So he's talking about a particular Mesopotamian text. The process of organization began with a lottery in which Anu were one god, one heaven, Enlil the earth, Ea the underground waters. So in some traditions, it's this kind of thing. In others, like I said, the Babylonian one, Tiamat, this goddess who gives birth to a brood of sea monsters, she gets killed by this god Marduk. He, out of her carcass, essentially creates the universe. In Egypt, really interesting, you see things having to do with the natural world, life, death, rebirth, the scarab, the dung beetle, that gets associated with this. And Michael, I'm just quoting from Michael's chapter here, talking about the sun, the river, and, sort of these people recreating the creation of the world in what they saw every day, with the waters of the river, with the journey of the sun across the horizon. And so Michael writes, if the sun and the river were grand, the dung beetle or the scarab was decidedly not. Yet its behavior of laying eggs in a ball of dung from which new beetles hatched came to represent self-creation. The scarab, the one who comes into being, became Egypt's principal symbol of rebirth. And so you have these kinds of stories, whether you're talking about Egyptian stories, Babylonian stories, Mesopotamian stories, and I think it's in this context that the Genesis creation story becomes so important, because as you'll discover, as you already know, it's a very different kind of story. It's not a god slaying a dragon, creating, heaven and earth. It's not the chase of the sun, sort of rejuvenating things. Very different kind of creation story there. So I don't know, Bob, if that's enough. I can go, don't get me wrong, it's not I can go on at great length about these stories, but
Well, that's a good start, because I think the most remarkable contribution of the Bible to the world that we know today, particularly the monotheistic world, is that concept of God, which was completely different from anything that existed at that time. Completely different. And I'd like to ask Reverend Krauss if he would elucidate on that a bit, please.
What I found fascinating, thank you, it's wonderful to be here and to be back after only a week. Some of you, it's wonderful to see you again, and I want to add to my colleagues, thanks to Msgr Sork for hosting us, and for Bob Rothman to facilitate. What strikes me in terms of what Amir just said, in the contrast to especially the Babylonian creation story, is creation in the biblical sense, and I think in the Quranic sense as well, is not a hands-on affair. It is God is somewhat removed from creation, but clearly involved with creation. Creation originates with God's initiative, but what particularly the Babylonian story of Marduk slaying Tiamat, the dragon, and then fashioning the world out of her carcass, is the understanding that the world is born in violence. Violence is at the root of creation. And it also means the world can fall back into chaos and violence at any moment. And it's a stark contrast to the biblical creation story, where violence is completely absent. Violence occurs in the biblical account after the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. It's a stark contrast, and I think a deliberate contrast in fashioning a story that says the world is essentially good. The way God created it is not born out of a struggle of the gods that is then reflected among humanity and on earth. Also, if we look a little more into the story, the first human beings were non-violent, even to the extent that they were vegetarian, the way it's portrayed in the story. So that strikes me as one major difference or contrast to the creation stories in the countries around the old Israelites.
Msgr Sork, would you like to expand on this as the unique nature of God compared to the concepts that existed before?
Well, I think that also when we're talking about creation story, we're talking about creation stories. The one that often they get thrown together. For example, I sometimes ask my students, who did God create first, man or woman? Of course, everybody said, well, man and the woman came from the side, woman came from the rib of man, etc. And then I have them read a chapter that said, male and female, he created them. Well, it represents a different tradition and a different, you might say, theological reason. The one that talks about, for example, at creation, that about the man created from the woman was the context of a man feeling unfulfilled. We just heard that in our scriptures last Sunday at Mass. The first reading from Genesis had that particular account. But then you have actually a newer account of creation, which talks about God creating the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And that was in the context of, why is it that we have to take a day off? Why the Shabbat? What's the purpose of that? And then, that was because at the very beginning, when God was trying to create order out of chaos, he did each of these things each day. And it's a very orderly presentation than the day he rested. So when we're looking at the creation story, it is creation stories. And it is, what was the purpose of that story, what they're trying to tell us?
Professor Hussain, you used the word ex nihilo before, from nothing, which is a unique concept, that God had the powers to create ex nihilo, and that this God was completely different from any concept that existed. And I still would say over and over again, I think this is the major contribution of the Bible to the world. But would you expand on the nature of God as presented in Genesis?
Sure, and then there's a couple of things there. One is the singleness, the oneness of God. In all these texts, it's a given that there are multiple gods and goddesses. In Egyptian temples, different gods, different goddesses worshipped. Each of those places had their own creation story, where not surprisingly, each of their gods or goddesses was the key figure in the creation story, And so to go from this world where there are multiple gods and goddesses to say, no, there's only one God, that's a huge difference. That this one God, creates as, the technical ex nihilo, out of nothing. That God speaks something. So that we can talk more about the Quran in a minute, but in the Islamic tradition, there isn't just one single creation story. It's not in a straightforward narrative in the way that the Bible is. So you find, bits of creation here, there, other parts of the text, but in some of the Quranic verses, there's this phrase that God says to a thing, be, and it is, that, God, through God's speech, calls things into existence. That's a different kind of thing. The fact that God does these things before God creates human beings. So, again, not getting too far ahead of ourselves, but one of my favorite chapters in the Quran is the 55th chapter, Surah Ar-Rahman, literally the chapter, the Surah of Ar-Rahman, the merciful. And the lines are really lovely. So it begins, as all the chapters do, with the phrase, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. And then Ar-Rahman, the merciful. Allama al-Quran, taught the Quran. Khalaq al-Insan, created the human being. Allamahul Bayan, taught them eloquence. And so it's a really interesting thing. Notice the order. God, the merciful, taught the Quran, created the human being. It's like, well, wait a minute. How can you teach the Quran if there's no human beings that have been created to teach this text too? Well, this idea that the Quran for Muslims is part of God. It's the speech of God, in the same way, not getting into technical terms and not poaching on either Reinhard or Msgr Sork's terms, but, the pre-existence of Jesus and, this notion of where this comes in. But I think that's really the key here, that A, you've got this one God, not multiple gods and goddesses. B, that this God can create through speaking, and C, that this God creates all sorts of things before this God creates human beings. Human beings aren't the first of God's creations, whether you're talking about the Genesis story or the Quranic story.
So I'd like to throw a wrench in all this. My role tonight is to make sure you leave with more questions than answers. So a word from the faithful opposition, if you will. To be clear, Jewish tradition has this very same notion of creation out of nothing. It's called in Hebrew Yesh Me'ayin. The famous medieval philosopher Saadia Gaon and others endorsed this many centuries ago. I imagine probably most of us here tonight were taught in Sunday school, right? God, there was nothing and then God created the world. This, in many ways, is based on a misunderstanding or mistranslation of the opening words of Genesis. The Hebrew Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'haaretz, we usually translate, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. That's probably not what the Hebrew really says. Please understand, anytime you're translating from one language to another, especially from a Semitic language like Hebrew to English, any translation is, in and of itself, a commentary. A better translation, indeed the translation I think that Bob and I'm curious to see what we all have tonight. We have our various Bibles. But the translation, the newer Jewish Publication Society translation, has the following. Please listen carefully. When God began to create heaven and earth, subjunctive clause, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I would suggest to you that that's a very different view from in the beginning God created heaven and earth. God started with nothing and out of nothing created something. But if you translate and understand the Hebrew, which I believe is accurate, when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, etc., it means that God started with some primordial stuff. And I think it's important to understand that, and we can, if you want, go into this later, at least in Jewish tradition, there are many traditions that say God started with something, that maybe God created other worlds and universes that didn't work out. And maybe later we'll get into Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and if we have enough food for breakfast, I'll tell you more about that.
Let me show you the translation here. You were curious. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless wasteland, and darkness covered the abyss, while a mighty wind swept over the waters. Creation, actually, the idea of creation being out of nothing in our tradition is actually later development. It really came 2nd or 3rd century with Greek philosophy and thought patterns. And that was because if God simply took some matter that was already existing, then God didn't have a hand in it. So that's why this thing was, but you're right, originally it was talking about there was chaos and he put order to chaos.
I need to give a slight introduction to the non-Jews in the audience. I am convinced that rabbis are taught in seminary, whenever you're stuck for a sermon, criticize the translation. They do it all the time. This is their nature. They don't like a translation, and they have other words to go with it. And I've heard many times.
But if even Christian translations agree, there must be something to it, right? But I have a question for Rabbi Diamond. If this is correct, and I think it's the correct translation, is the Jewish teaching then that matter, the stuff God creates with, is co-eternal with God, existed at the same time? Because it raises another question. Somebody says, where does God come from, or where does matter come from? And there's this old saying, well, it's a turtle another creation myth, the world is resting on a turtle, and somebody says, who's holding up the turtle? And somebody says, it's turtles all the way down. So it raises that question, and I wonder what Jewish theology says about this.
Again, the challenge is, at least in the Jewish tradition, one answer generates another 10 questions. And both to my colleagues' comments here, in Jewish tradition too, it's a much later, actually probably later than Christianity, probably in the 9th century, did we begin to get this notion that we have to prove creation out of nothing because God has to be there at the beginning. But it's also an old Jewish legend, tradition called a midrash, that the Torah came before creation. God used the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as a blueprint to create the world. Well, if that's the case, who created the Torah?
I think the whole question and the puzzlement goes against the misunderstanding as if God in some ways is part of creation. Some early, I think it was Soviet astronauts, thought we circled the world and didn't see God, so therefore God doesn't exist. It's that notion that somehow God is an object within creation, a much bigger object than other objects, a more powerful object. But the creation stories really say God is categorically different from anything that science can investigate and prove, namely, the world itself is not divine, the world itself is not to be worshipped. There is a cause, an origin of the world that is not part of the web and fabric and causal connection of the world itself, rather than the Christian theologians in the Middle Ages actually said it's not correct to even say that God is, that God has being. We can't say that. So we get into deep and difficult matters, and we're not going to sort it out and comprehend it tonight. But
Try it.
Well,
I'm not
if
trying
I may,
it.
the other thing I would add is that at least in my view, and I think it's a pretty normative Jewish view, Genesis 1 and 2 don't prove God's existence. God is just there. You know, the first verse of the Bible doesn't say, here is God. Let me introduce myself. I'm God. God is just there. God is always there. And I think probably the key takeaway in all our traditions is how different this is from the creation myths that came before. One God, a loving God, a God who is creator, a God who takes presumably chaos and creates order, a God who works 6 days and rests on the Sabbath, a God who cares for human beings, a God who sees the first man being alone and lonely and creates a fitting helpmate for him. This is so different than what was out, the literature that was there beforehand.
Msgr. Sork, the Logos, the story beginning with the Gospel of John fits right into this, I believe.
Actually use the very same words. NRK. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So it's no accident that John parallels Genesis when he writes his gospel about Jesus. John's gospel is much different from the other three because John begins what they sometimes call Christology from above. In other words, the idea of the eternal Word in time took on flesh, where the other ones begin Christology from below, where they emphasize the humanity of Jesus and later on go to that.
Okay, so we start right off with God who has the power to do whatever God wants to do. And God says, let there be light. Who's he talking to? He doesn't need to make an announcement. He can do it himself. Who is the beneficiary of let there be light? Somebody?
Bob, I'll jump in. I actually find a later verse much more perplexing when God says, let us make man in our image.
Oh, we're going to get to that one.
What do you mean we? Who is God talking to there? Let us make man in an image? And again, that's such a fascinating question. Among the answers in my own tradition are perhaps God is using the royal we, okay? Or perhaps it's a heavenly court, celestial beings, angels, other divine beings. There is no one answer in Jewish tradition. I actually find that much more problematic, if you will, than let there be light. No, maybe God talks to himself. That's okay too.
Well, there are, in the Psalms, I see I came prepared. Psalm 86, there is no one like you among the gods, O Lord, and there are no deeds like yours. Psalm 89, who in the skies can equal the Lord, can compare with the Lord? among the divine beings. And Psalm 82, God stands in the divine assembly among the divine beings. He pronounces judgment. So there is a tradition of a heavenly court, and I'm not sure, they don't play a prominent role. I'm not sure what they're there for or what their purpose is.
Well, I think that there's been an evolving understanding of who God is. I mean, you look at the Ten Commandments, the first one says, you shall not have other gods besides me, which means he's not the only one. Of course, later on, with the Shema, that's a very strong statement. He is one, there is no other. But people came to an evolving understanding of who God is, and I think that bears it out in the scriptures itself.
Well, I think monotheism really became strong and had its real feet on the ground with Deuteronomy and with the issue of that book. Archaeologically, there were examples of some other gods being worshipped, though even among the Hebrews, though the God of Israel was the strongest God, but there were others. So I think that's true.
I would like to come back to your question, who is God speaking to? And it's fascinating that in speaking, God creates something that is different from God, namely creation, light, so on and so forth. So God's speech itself creates the other, to whom God speaks. The question is, what does that say about the relationship of God to the world? What is the world? What is light? What are animals, trees, stuff, rocks? They're not divine. They're not to be worshipped. They're different from God, and yet they have their origin in God. They're, in some sense, to me that says creation is to be revered, but it is not to be worshipped. It has its origin in God, but it is clearly distinct from God. And the mistake that then people make, say, with the golden calf, is to mistake objects, creation, things for the origin of those objects, namely in God. And it's a big theme then in the Quran, that the injunction again and again and again, that God can have no partners, that God is unique. The world goes back to God's creation, but the world is distinct. And I have always wondered, and I didn't come up with the question, is this distinction of the world, robbing the world of its divine character, the world is not God, mountains are not God, and the weather is not a deity. Does that open the way for, so to speak, the dispassionate and the scientific investigation of the world to begin with? Is natural science, in other words, based on the concept that the world is not divine? Is the world being demythologized, so to speak, with the creation story, both in the Bible and in the Quran as well? The world is not God, so therefore we can look at it, examine it under the microscope without it reacting back and punishing us, so to speak.
I just want to say something there too, because it's also that other question of, is it the gods that, or God who creates humans? Is it humans that create God? Where do these stories come in? We have a particular history for how the biblical text came into being, or the New Testament text, or the Quran. And so in this world that is polytheistic, makes much more sense to believe in multiple gods and goddesses. This idea of one God is just ludicrous, and especially this God who's a God of the powerless, a God who is a God of widows and orphans. Who worships such a God? God is the God of power. God is the God of might. God is the God of, these really interesting kinds of things. And I was thinking about this, just sort of by chance. I still had the chapter, Michael's chapter open, and he's talking about men and women. And he says this, and I'm quoting here, "The male deity most favored by Greek women was Asclepius because of his assistance in the most critical issues in a woman's life, fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. An Egyptian child-nourishing goddess named Taweret, especially popular among commoners, was depicted as a hippopotamus, a species whose females were known for their ferocity in protecting their young." And then he ends with this great line from Strabo, the Greek geographer. He says, "The Greek geographer Strabo, 64 BC to 21 CE, aptly remarked," and this is a quote, "all agree that women are the chief founders of religion. It is women who encourage men to more attentive worship of the gods." Really interesting kinds of things there. Like, where do these texts come from? Who are these texts addressing? Are these texts written for members within the tradition, or are they written for members of the tradition to be able to argue against people from other traditions that are there at the time? Are there multiple gods and goddesses in heaven, or is there one God? And when you're speaking to people who believe that there are different things there, how do you understand that?
I would invoke the thought of the late revered Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory, who I think Reinhard probably had the best Jewish answer I've heard to your question, which is he spoke often about radical amazement. He would walk in Morningside Heights near my alma mater, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and an area with Union Theological Seminary, a beautiful area in New York, Upper West Side of New York, and he would say, "Look at those trees, look at the river, look at nature," not to worship it, on the contrary, to see the hand of one God in this beautiful world of ours. And I like that concept of radical amazement. I think that's a good approach to answering the question you raised.
I've often imagined a conversation between a Jew in the first century, before the first century, somewhere in that time frame, talking to a Greek or Roman. "My God is your God." "Yeah, right. Come on, you're joking. My God is the God of all. Then why are you a little nation and I'm dominating you?" And on and on and on. That concept of one God with the powers and strength of the God that we worship would have absolutely been out of line and totally unbelievable, I think, to any contemporary person at that time.
Well, not even that time, in the present time. And so I'm thinking back now, 30 years ago when I was in graduate school and TAing a world religions class, and one of my fellow TAs was a young Chinese woman who was studying, some things about women in the Confucian tradition. But, she was one of the TAs for this class. And she was trying to get her head precisely around this Jewish notion of God. And she's like, well, wait a minute. So there's one God. Yes. And the Jews are the chosen people of this one God. Yes. But sometimes this God, the God of the Jews, uses other people to punish his chosen people. Yes. Who would worship such a God? She says, this is crazy. Why would you worship a God who is your God, but has other people do bad things to you? This is not any kind of, it's just really interesting. So it's not even in the historical period, it's in the modern period of people thinking like, this is a pretty strange idea. Everyone knows you worship a God who does great things for you. And if if that God isn't doing great things for you, that's not your God. There's another God that you should worship. Yeah.
To follow up on that, many scholars believe that the real concept of monotheism, of one God, was really born out of the experience of the Babylonian exile. This horrendous experience of the Jewish people losing their spiritual and national center. Jerusalem was destroyed, the first temple that Solomon built was destroyed. And to any nation in the ancient world whose capital and center of residence and worship was destroyed, simply vanished. Because if the God is not strong enough to even protect his own temple, what good is a God like that? And it required the interpretation of the Hebrew prophets to say, it's not that this God is too small, but God is so powerful, as you said, that God can use other nations. He is, in fact, the only God. He is also the God of the nations. And so it's interesting that the notion of the one God, not a remote God, but a God who is caring for his people, who has moral values, who instills ethics, because this is the God, the biblical, the Abrahamic God, the God who has compassion with people, was actually born out of suffering of the Jewish people, not in some abstract sense like the Greek philosophers. In many ways, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph has little to do with the God of the philosophers, this remote God. So, and I think it is no accident that the biblical God was born out of the suffering of his chosen people.
And sometimes when I'm trying to address the very questions that Reinhard raised, and to my mind, almost the miracle of how Jewish life and thought continued after the destruction of the temple, I tell my students, while most peoples viewed their gods as living in their temple or temples, perhaps, the temple in Jerusalem was God's vacation home. Okay, so maybe that helped us to survive that calamity.
There is a serious school that believes that the Torah, the 5 books, were written in Babylonia during the exile. They can cite specific examples. In Genesis, in the first, the creation story, when they describe Eden, there are 4 rivers coming from Eden. The Nishon, the Gihon, and nobody knows who they are, and the Tigris and the Euphrates, and we all know what they are and where they exist. You have the story centered in Nineveh, which we get to later in the Bible. And there are other things that connect strongly to Babylonia. So there are people who believe that, at least if it wasn't written, one of the problems you have in biblical scholarship is trying to separate out, which is impossible, how long the story existed from when it was written down. They're 2 separate items completely, and they're indistinguishable. You can't separate them out. Let me introduce another subject. Let there be light. And God separated light from darkness in the first day. In the 5th day, God created the sun and the moon. How do you separate light from darkness, and how do you define a day without a sun? Of course, God can define a day any way he wants. But these are interesting questions that go on. And I think Rabbi Diamond, maybe now is the right time to get into some mysticism, because in Jewish mysticism, dark and light are 2 separate items. Dark is not the absence of light. Dark is dark, and light is light. And I think it would be interesting to talk about that in this relationship.
Okay, fasten your seatbelts. Okay. To be full disclosure, we didn't study mysticism when I was in rabbinical school. One of the very famous professors, in many ways the head of my graduate school, my seminary in New York, Dr. Saul Lieberman, thought he was commenting on a very famous scholar of Jewish mysticism in Israel, Professor Gershon Sholem, who really opened up the scholarly field of Jewish mysticism. And Lieberman was once asked about that, and he said, very solemnly, the history of nonsense is nonsense. Okay, which kind of told you what he thought about Jewish mysticism. And so I was never taught this in seminary. It was a subject that was absolutely forbidden. And now I'm very pleased to tell you that rabbis and Jews spent a lot of time studying mysticism. It was only later in life that I got to it. Again, this subject could easily occupy us through breakfast. there is something, I mentioned earlier that there's this notion that God looked into the Torah. God used the Bible, as it were, the 5 books of Moses, as a blueprint from the world. That we find already in the Zohar, the classic text of Jewish mysticism likely from 13th century Spain. A couple centuries later, 16th century, came a rabbi named Isaac Luria. He lived in the beautiful town of Tzfat in northern Israel, where they would go out on Friday evenings dressed in white and welcome the Sabbath. And he was he was the originator of what we call Lurianic mysticism. And he taught a concept which is so radically challenging to us. He asked the question, how could a perfect God create an imperfect world? Which, by the way, is a pretty good question. Why would God not create a perfect world? He says God had to contract himself. The Hebrew term is tzimtzum. God had to withdraw from the world and send forth 10 vessels filled with light. Kalim, vessels filled with light, in order to create the world. But these vessels, according to Lurianic mysticism, could not contain the primordial light. They simply weren't equipped enough. We might say today they were faulty. They should be sent back to the manufacturer, okay? So these vessels could not contain the light, and they shattered, they broke. And this is a central concept of Lurianic mysticism, that's how light came into the world. And our role as human beings is to gather the scattered sparks of light that are found throughout creation. It's a powerful concept. Some of you may have heard the phrase tikkun olam. You know, every one of my students, Jewish and non-Jewish at LMU, knows tikkun olam. It means repairing the world. It's a phrase we use today to talk about typically social action, social justice. Actually, tikkun olam, the doctrine started with Rabbi Luria, Isaac Luria. And he felt that it was our role as Jews, as Christians, as Muslims, as people in the world, to gather up the sparks of holiness left from these divine emanations and to bring them together. And that's our task as human beings. And that, to him, really was the true tikkun olam. That was the true repair and healing of the world. So that's my brief lesson in Jewish mysticism. Come to LMU, you'll get the full lesson.
No, and just following up on what Rabbi Diamond said, as a good Canadian, I have to, what do the kids call it, represent. My favorite Jewish mystic is a good Canadian, the blessed Leonard Cohen. The singer, songwriter, and some of you know his song, Anthem, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And so when you were saying that, it made me think of that line from Leonard about, where the light comes in. And when you were saying that too, it was funny because it's that notion of what can contain the power of God. Like, I'm not surprised that these vessels shattered because, if it's really God, how do you make something that, can contain this light of God? And the Quran talks not about that, but about, people asking God to appear to them, and God's response is, look, if I appeared to you, Mount Sinai would be destroyed. Like the power of God is so intense, so powerful there that it's that disruptive kind of thing. And I suppose now I'm thinking, because it's late and I'm tired of the scene in a great religious film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Ark of the Covenant sort of, when the Nazis sort of open the top, and of course it's the fragments of the Torah that literally like melt the guy's face, because that's the power of God. There's really interesting kinds of things there.
And then there was a story that the Ark of the Covenant was really a capacitor that controlled, maintained charges in different ways.
May I just add that, just to come back for a moment to the account I shared earlier, what's particularly fascinating about that is essentially the world came into being through a divine error, through a mistake, which is really, when you think about it, theologically very interesting. That and it also leads some Jewish philosophers to speculate this is how God created multiple worlds, and some of these vessels that couldn't contain the sparks were other worlds that were created that didn't work out. But maybe indeed God created some other worlds that did work out, and I'll leave that to NASA to figure out.
Did God make a mistake intentionally or inadvertently, or how does God make mistakes?
Boy. Who am I to question that? I would come back.
What do the sages say?
What don't they say about that? They don't seem to be bothered by that. I come back to what Amir said a moment ago. Who or what could contain divinity. Maybe if there was a mistake with God, it was thinking to create a world that was perfect. There was no way that could happen. There's an ancient Jewish debate. In Jewish tradition, you have at least 3 opinions for every 2 people. And there's an ancient Jewish debate, should the world have been created? Would it have been better if God hadn't created the world? One rabbi says, would have been better not to have created the world. The second rabbi says, no. And the end is, the decision of the sages in rabbinic times was, it would have been better that God had not created this world, but since God did so, let's make the best of it.
And what are the chances of that happening? God not creating the world.
We seem to muck it up pretty badly. I know you didn't want to get into the Garden of Eden, but my favorite midrash, my favorite Jewish commentary on the Bible is this wonderful account that God took Adam and Eve around the beautiful Garden of Eden, and God said, look at how beautiful is my creation. Look at all the beautiful trees. Look at, this is the perfect world. If you mess it up, if you muck it up, there will be nobody to set it right. If you ruin this world, there will be I will not step in. God will not step in to set it right. Which, by the way, is a powerful lesson for environmental justice and taking care of the world in which we live. Because if we don't take care of it, nobody else is going to step in to do so.
I also think we need to be careful of not taking these texts as history. They are really poetry. They are texts like poems that seek to make sense of our place in the world, our relationship with other human beings, the question, why is there something rather than nothing, and why is there this particular world in which we find ourselves? If we mistake it for history, I think we run into questions, how can there be light before there is the sun? And that is a scientific question, and that is complete nonsense. But I would like to get to this question, what does the biblical and the Quranic story say, for example, about what's the purpose of it? What is the relationship, for example, of human beings to one another if we all go back to one creator? At some point, it doesn't make sense. It's not the natural conclusion when you look around that there should be one God who made us all. We are so incredibly different. There must be multiple gods, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of gods, you would naturally conclude from our differences. It's a radical concept to say there is one God who created each and every one of us. What does that statement say? It says, despite our radical, amazing differences, our not getting along, we are at least cousins, if not sisters and brothers. We belong to one family. We have to get on with one another. To me, that's, for example, one of the profound statements of the creation story, to say, no, we are not created by different gods, and my tribe can kill and maybe eat members of your tribe. We are all created and go back to one creator. So it says something about humanity. It also says something about the natural world and how should we treat the natural world. And I hope we get a little into the question of environment and environmentalism. Yesterday we had a report come out by the UN that we have 12 years before catastrophe hits if we don't do something very drastic. To me, that has something to do with the creation story. If it's God's world that has been entrusted to us, if it's God's property that we are taking care of, that we are stewards, caretakers of creation, that's something different than we say, well, we can just trash the place and find another planet.
I wanted to say a couple of things there in response to what Reinhard said. First about the Bible and history, and I'm smiling because I'm thinking about one of my teachers. I had the extraordinary privilege of studying with a man named Northrop Frye, this amazing sort of scholar of English at the University of Toronto, and he was writing probably his most famous book, a book called The Great Code, the Bible and Literature. And he said, in class a number of times, whenever I should backtrack, he was an ordained Protestant minister, so that this is a religious person, this is not an atheist. He says, yeah, whenever the Bible gets something right historically, it only does so accidentally. And I thought that was this hilarious, kind of point there. But then you talk about, the fact that it's more than history, it's more powerful than that. It really is, how do we understand the world? How do we understand our place in the world? And at a deep level, that's the songs we sing, that's the stories we tell, those are the things that really matter to us. And so if you look at the Quranic text, it's explicit about the differences among human beings as being one of the signs of God, which means it's a positive thing. So, the 30th chapter of the Quran, Surah Ar-Rum, the translates literally as the Romans, but it really should be the Greeks, because the Romans in the 7th century were, of course, Greeks. It was the Byzantine Empire that Islam sort of encountered, but that says, and among God's signs, the text says, is the diversity of your tongues and colors. The fact that we speak different languages, the fact that we look different from each other, that's one of the signs from God. Later, not in that chapter, but in a different one, the text says, if God had so willed, God have created you all as one nation. God doesn't do that. God makes us into, and again, a different line from the Quran, God makes us into nations and tribes so that we might know each other. That's the purpose, if you will, to understand each other. And that this idea that, when we return to God, that's where God will explain to us how we differed, what happened, and what sets people apart is their awareness of God. The Quran talks about this concept that makes one person better than another. And it's not whether that person is a Muslim or not. It's this notion of taqwa is the Arabic term. It literally means God consciousness, God awareness, that the best people are the people that have the most of this category, quality. And the text is explicit that this is not something that is limited to Muslims, and that other folks may have more of this than Muslims do. And so that this sense of, that ties in something we haven't talked about, but this idea that, not just that there's one God, but there's this existence, and how we live this existence determine what happens in the world to come. And what does that, and that world is eternal, this world is temporal, all those things. But the other, going to Reinhard's point, to Rabbi Diamond's point, that, the Quran is explicit of God is the creator of the worlds, plural. The first chapter of the Quran, the Fatiha, that every Muslim recites numerous times in the day if they're praying, it talks about praise be to God, the Lord of all the worlds. Not just the Lord of this world, not just Lord of the world, but the Lord of the worlds, plural. Really interesting there. The text talks about the creation of the heavens, plural, and the earth. So what does that mean? Where are these heavens? Where are these worlds? Is it just simply, looking up at the night sky and realizing that, there are other worlds out there? Is there something else going on there?
Well, this is really fascinating, because in the Quran, God created worlds and different peoples. In the Bible, the creation of different peoples was a punishment for the Tower of Babel. This is really interesting. I don't know, anybody want to carry that on further?
Well, I think that case, it was actually because people were thinking of themselves rather than others that confusion was created. And so I think that was the context of what happened with the Tower of Babel.
And it is that sense, too, of the connection, among people, because they're all children of the same God. So it's not that just, there's the Muslim God that creates Muslims, or when the text talks about, people being created in God's image, it's just Jews and Christians and not Muslims or Hindus or atheists. Well, no, if you believe that God created everyone, God created everyone, and everyone is created in the image of God. And there's a line in the Quran that echoes not a biblical text, but a Talmudic text, in chapter 5 of the Quran, where God says, and thus we ordained for the children of Israel that if you killed one human, it's as if you killed all humanity. This idea that because there's one, and that's an interesting kind of thing, that's not a biblical thing, that's a Talmudic idea about because there's one common ancestor, everyone comes from that same ancestor. That means, if you kill one person, it's like destroying all of humanity. And conversely, if you save one person's life, that's as if you saved all of humanity, precisely because there's that connection among peoples.
Bob, if I may, I'd like to raise a question that I don't mean to usurp your role, but A question I would ask my fellow panelists is, how do we reconcile the biblical account of 6 days of creation with modern scientific knowledge? Since my course at LMU, I always wrestle with, the students and I wrestle with this question of faith and reason. What do you make of the biblical account of creation? It's certainly in our country today, there are many, many people who take that literally, not just as a statement of faith, but as a statement of that God, the world came into being in 6 days, which is at least at odds with the theory of evolution and the Big Bang theory, et cetera.
Well, not only that, as part of your introduction, if you're going to ask that question as a rabbi, then I have to ask you to explain to the people, a month ago, the Jewish year 5779 began, and the origin of that was what?
I'm going to hold off on that because I've got the answer to that, but I really
I won't
wanna-
let you. You have to answer it.
No, I will answer it, I promise. But I posed a question to my colleagues, to our colleagues on the panel, and I'm curious, before I answer that question from my own perspective, what our various faith traditions say about creation and science.
I mean, I would simply give the same answer. It's poetry. It's poetry. And we do not confuse poetry with scientific articles. So if we talk about the creation story of depicting the emergence of life through successive periods, there is a parallel to the scientific discovery that the world in which we live has become more complex despite living in a universe that tends towards less complexity. And the second law of thermodynamics, entropy increases, chaos increases. We live in a place that has become, according to scientific views, increasingly complex. How this happened, I think it would, I mean, to me it would be absurd to take a poem literally.
I would say, the Bible is not a scientific textbook. We learn from science about origins. The Big Bang, by the way, I believe came from a Catholic monk, the theory when originally risen. Does not comprise all our belief that God is the creator of all. The Bible at that time would try to give an explanation of, for example, the 6 days. Why is it that we honor the Sabbath? Well, because of this. But they had no idea of evolution, Big Bang, and all that was beyond their understanding of somebody. Just because the Bible is inspired word of God does not mean that those who put it down had some special insight that means we have to accept everything literally scientifically. I've seen some people try to say, well, we accept evolution, but it was a different, a day meant a billion years or whatever it is. No, as Reinhard said, it's a different form of literature. And it's trying to explain why we do certain things, how we came to be, in the best way they could within their culture and tradition.
It's simply similar to when, for example, in the Christian scriptures, in the Gospels, Jesus says, I'm the gate to the sheep. Right? So it's a metaphor. If you start arguing, what is this gate made of? What are the hinges? What kind of wood is it? It gets very absurd very quickly.
So I was going to say a couple of things there, and then one was, it's probably almost exactly a decade ago, it must have been 2007, 2008, I was actually teaching a course at, well, let me start that again. I was asked to teach a course on, Muslim Jewish theology, and I said, I can do the Muslim part, I kind of need some help with the Jewish part, if I'm going to be honest with the students, so can I have my friend Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, who at that time was still the rabbi at UCLA, Hillel, can he teach with me? They said, yeah, sure, you can do that. So it was great to be like teaching a course as a faculty member with another faculty member who's there with you. Is just this. I mean, I learned as much from Chaim as I think the students learned from us. But he did this one day where he brings in, a Torah scroll. I mean, partly to impress upon the students of how it is that the Jews, read the text. It's not just a book between two covers, but this scroll here. And he says to them, look, I'm a Jew, so this text is important. I'm a rabbi, so this text is particularly important. That said, this is not a science text. This is not a textbook. If you're using this as a science text, he didn't say it in these words, but I'm remembering this. There's something wrong with you, like, you know, in that kind of way. So there's that part. So it's not science. Now you have people, and I'm talking now in the Muslim world, who try to sort of prove the Quran through science, which is like, you understand you're actually putting science above God, right? Like that becomes your criterion of proof. And so again, when I was in grad school, there was this really interesting book. I'm blocking the name of the author, but the book was called Embryology in the Quran, and it was a guy who was like an embryologist, who was a non-Muslim, who, you know, had encountered Islam and had read things in the Quran that talk about the development of the embryo. And for him, that was the divine proof, that how could this text in the 7th century be talking about sort of principles that were sort of consistent with embryology? And it's like, no, then you're making science your God, which is perfectly fine if that's what you want to do, but that's not what religious folks do, of saying, you know, here's the science behind this. You know, almost by definition, it's something that it's an old saying that, you know, they're asking different questions. You know, science asks the how questions, you know, theology, religion asks the why questions. You know, those are different kinds of questions there, you know, different sorts of answers, but they're not mutually exclusive. That as a Muslim who has been teaching since 2005 in a Jesuit school, it's been fascinating for me to learn a little bit about the history of Catholic higher education, Catholic universities, and there's this wonderful book written by a Jesuit at Georgetown, Father John Hoy, you know, that talked about this. And he really, and John was the one I was privileged to work with him a little bit at Georgetown a few years ago, that said, yeah, it's the doctrine of the incarnation. You know, because God, in the Christian understanding, comes to earth in human form, because God has created the world, that means the world is a good thing. The world needs to be studied. That's why you have Catholic universities. That's, you know, to study God's world, to study God's creation, to study humanity. That's the same thing for me as a Muslim, that, you know, there's a line in the Quran about the search for knowledge being incumbent upon Muslims. And so as a Muslim, to learn about the world is to help us learn more about God. It's not that these are mutually exclusive realities. You can't do this. It's the one helps the other, but they're different.
I'm so glad I'm batting cleanup on this question, and I'm really pleased. This may be in a story. Mark this date on your calendar. The four of us all agree. We don't look at the Bible as science, but let's be clear. In its own day and age, the Bible was science, people. You know, the biblical account of the waters below and the waters above and the separation of heaven and earth, that was science at a certain point. It's not science for us today. And Bob, I will answer your question at last. This is the year 5779 on the Jewish calendar. How do we get to a dating like that? Somebody years ago, it may have been in Maimonides, it may well have preceded Maimonides in the medieval period, added up all the ages in the Bible, all right, and got to a date and said, so according to very traditional Jewish interpretation today, the world is 5,779 years old, okay? The numbering is called Anno Mundi, the year of the world. I don't believe that, like my colleagues. I think I don't turn to the Bible, I don't turn to the stories in Genesis 1 and 2 for scientific knowledge of how the world came into being. I turn to the Bible and particularly to the stories in Genesis for how I should act in this world, relationship between man and woman, environmental justice, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, let's be clear that there are many people who do believe that. There was a very famous rabbi, some of you may know of the Chabad movement, Lubavitch Hasidim. I like to say that someday when we finally land astronauts on Mars, they will find two houses there. They will find a Chabad house with a nice Jewish couple that will be asking you, the man, to put on phylacteries and the woman to light Shabbat candles. They will also, and if there are any Mormons in the audience, I do a lot of work with the Latter-day Saints, so I say this with great joy. There will also be two more missionaries there at another house, and they will have a copy of the Book of Mormon and will ask if you'd like to come to the sacrament meeting on Sunday. I fully expect that will be when we finally land on Mars or some other planet someday. In the meantime, I mentioned the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last rabbi or leader of this Chabad Lubavitch group, because he was asked the question. He was trained at the Sorbonne in science and engineering, and he said, Rebbe, how can you square that with the fossil evidence in the world? And he actually said, it's recorded, he said, God put the fossils in the earth to test our faith. Okay? Intriguing. I personally find it hard to believe in God that doesn't have anything better to do with her time than to trick us with fossils. That's my own view. So I don't turn to the Bible like my colleagues for science, but let's be honest here. If there were others on the panel, maybe more evangelical Christians, for example, if there were more evangelical Jews, fundamentalist Jews, I think they would. If you go to the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., it's dedicated to reconciling these views. So let's be clear, there's millions of people in the world, wonderful, good people, who take this literally as science, and they cannot see, will not see a contradiction between science and their faith.
I'd like to just add a little bit more of the question that you posed, Rabbi Bob, and that was, the numbers. We have another number we're talking about right now is 2018. It's sometimes called the Common Era, and before that, before the Common Era, sometimes it's called AD, Anno Domini, BC, before Christ. But actually, Jesus was not born 2018 years ago. It was probably even a bit earlier, so even our calendar doesn't exactly synchronize.
Well, I've still not forgiven for the word not getting out to the unicorns to get on the ark.
I would like to follow up on the people who are not on this panel, but who make up a significant percentage of the American public, and that is conservative Christians. And I do have a question for my Muslim and Jewish colleagues. But let me just quote from an article of June of this year from just 20, and this is, I think, in light of what we've been talking about, if creation is God's good handiwork, what is our role as human beings to care and take care of creation? And this is an article from Slate magazine from June of 2018, and let me just quote. Just 20% of committed Christians consider themselves active participants in the environmental movement, a number that has barely moved for a quarter century and represents less than half of the proportion of environmentalists in the general population. The proportion of Christians who prioritize environmental concerns over energy production has dropped by about 20 percentage points in the last 25 years. And indications are that the more ardently Christian an American becomes, the less he or she cares about the environment. Evangelicals are the least environmentally inclined of committed U.S. Christians. And about 1/4 of Americans are evangelical Christians. The question is that I would like to ask I'm shocked by this, but the question I would ask of my Muslim and Jewish colleagues, is there any equivalent in the Jewish and Muslim tradition of people who are actively opposed to not caring for God's creation?
So I think there's some interesting things there, and before I say it, I'm going to make an analogy. So, growing up in Canada, the largest Protestant church in Canada is the United Church of Canada, and a couple of years ago at their general council, they voted to divest the pension funds, which are quite enormous, from fossil fuel companies, which created issues with United Church members in Alberta who make their living off of fossil fuel. And so these really interesting kinds of things, so that the national church has said, we're going to divest out of this industry, and you got folks saying, but this is how we make a living, this is how we feed our kids. And so I think, certainly we sort of stereotype the Middle East as being Islamic, and B, with oil production. And so if you're looking at, the production of oil and the way in which that comes in, the kinds of care for the environment. Now, in many ways, it's a very different kind of thing. Like, can you blame someone who lives in a rural environment who burns wood for fire and for heating, that this is polluting. Well, you can't, because they don't have another kind of resource there. But oftentimes in those places, you do have people who precisely have to take care of the environment because that's what they have. They can't go to the store to buy, bottles of water. The water comes from this river, so you better make sure that river or whatever, that well is clean. And so in the Islamic tradition, broadly speaking, you have this sense of the earth being entrusted to human beings, and human beings being the representatives of God. And so having to take care of that. If someone entrusts you with something, you give it back to them in the same condition, or ideally better condition than they gave it to you. You don't, someone lends you their car, you don't drive around and crash it and scratch it up and give it back to you and say, oh, sorry. Ideally, you'll take care of it, you'll fill it up, you'll wash it, you'll do that kind of thing. And I use this metaphor because I'm a car guy, and so I know those aren't environmentally sound, but what do? I like cars. And so, it's that kind of thing that, do you think of the earth as a trust that has been given to human beings, and it's our job, therefore, to take care of that trust? Or do you see it as something to be, exploited for its natural resources? Unfortunately, you have Muslims who've made lots of money exploiting the natural resources, out of the earth.
Yeah, Reinhard, it's a wonderful question. I don't know in the Jewish tradition of any group that theologically works in a different way. I mean, the concept I alluded to earlier is a Jewish rabbinic principle, Adam Shutafo Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we are God's partners in caring for creation, and that's pretty much viewed across the board. Having said that, I don't know that there are many of my fellow Jews and this is just not a priority for them. I don't think it's theological, that it's a fundamentally theologically different understanding than I might have of what that means to be partners with God in environmental justice, et cetera. But for some people, everybody puts their priorities and acts upon them in different ways, and for some it's just probably not a huge issue, but for many people it is, obviously.
Yeah, I think I wanted to bring out this difference. There is, to my knowledge, and I was shocked to learn this, in the Muslim and Jewish tradition, no movement that, not out of necessity, but out of theological intention, is opposed to environmental concerns. And I think it has to do with a particular strand of Christian theology. It was beautifully summed up by James Watts, who was the Secretary of the Interior during the Reagan administration. And he was entrusted by our government with caring for the natural resources of this country. And when he was asked in a congressional hearing, he said, I really don't know how many generations we still have until Jesus comes anyway. So we don't really need to care for the environment. This is not mainline Christian theology, it's not Roman Catholic theology, but there is a significant percentage of our populace in this country who holds to this theology: the earth can burn because Jesus is coming soon anyway. And I find that terribly shocking, and it goes, to me, against anything that the biblical account says about God creating a good earth and placing us in a garden to take care of it.
Your comment reminds me of a lovely Jewish teaching that if you're planting a tree and somebody comes and announces the Messiah is here, in Jewish tradition, of course, we believe the Messiah is yet to come, you should finish planting the tree and then go out to greet the Messiah, which I think is a very powerful statement about priorities in this world.
Professor Hussain, you were drawing comparisons with Jewish and Muslim teachings, and I think that there's one particular thing that I'm going to bring up now that I really find interesting. God takes Adam and he marches all of the animals before Adam, and he says, Adam, give them names. In the Quran, God marches all the animals before Adam, and he tells Adam, these are their names, which speaks very loudly to the difference in to me, the difference in the relationship between God and man. And I'm anxious to hear your thoughts on that.
No, that's fascinating because you do have those things. So in many ways, the stories of the Quran and the Bible, meaning that the Jewish texts are much more similar. In other ways, stories in the Quran and the Christian New Testament are much more similar. But precisely this idea of the relationship of God and human beings, that in both of those texts, the animals, other things are created first, then you've got Adam created, then you've got, the instructions. So is this part of the, the hierarchy that God is God and human beings are not? And so here's God telling Adam what the names of these animals are, rather than in the biblical text, as Bob has said, the other way around, where Adam is the one who has the agency and Adam is the one that names the animals. It's the same thing with when humanity is created in the Quran. But so on the one hand, it talks about the power that God has because God is God and humans are not God. On the other hand, in that same passage, God creates the human being and then tells God's angels who have been created before this to bow down before this, because the human being, is the best of God's creation. And you've got Iblis, Satan, who says, no, I can't do this, for a very good theological reason, that if you're the one and only one God, I bow down to you. How can I bow down before your creation? And then Iblis, Satan, says to God, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's basically like, do you have any idea what this thing will do? Like, we sing your praises, this thing will unleash bloodshed, violence, and you can sort of see that. I mean, I'm smiling not because it's funny, because you can see this kind of thing of, what is it that we've done? What about all the horrific violence and bloodshed and things that we've done? But here's God saying, no, Satan, the human being is the best of my creation. You go away from here. And Satan basically asks, can I have some time to tempt this thing to show you who's right and who's wrong? And God says, in a bizarre way, sure, go ahead. And you think, well, what does this say about God? But it's really fascinating about, on the one hand, God is God and the human being gets instruction from God. On the other hand, God says the best of God's creation is the human being. So it's that paradox.
Questions? Got a lot to ask. Who wants to step into this one? Step into whatever you like.
Go ahead. Oh, you'll look. So, towards the concept of more than one world and maybe more than one universe, I've heard it described that the first topic we were talking about, the Bereshit, instead of in the beginning, it's in a beginning. I've heard a rabbi to discuss that.
You're asking a rabbi to make another translation. Boy, would he like to do that.
I like that one too. You can translate Bereshit a number of ways. It can, in the beginning and a beginning, multiple worlds, multiple universes. Sure, go for it.
One more?
Okay. I wanted to get your take on this comment. Okay, Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And then this is a reply. The infinite has no beginning. This word beginning is employed to signify the only. That is the eternal verity and unity of God and man, including the universe.
What are you quoting from?
The Science and Health with Kids Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, yeah.
And who would you like to ask?
Anyone, yeah.
Anyone? Better pick one, Michelle.
I don't know. I think we're a little stumped. We're not sure what the question is.
You want to clarify the question?
I think my question is, the infinite has no beginning, so how do you reconcile the creation story, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, not one to which we have a good answer. But, for example, Augustine, one of the major Christian theologians, said that with the world, God also created time. Because otherwise you could say in the beginning and what was before the beginning. So I think it's a very appropriate comment to say from eternity, or I don't quite able to remember what you said, but it's from eternity, from the beginning, rather than at a particular moment in time. Christian theologians, and I think Muslim theologians as well, and I would assume, I can't speak for Jewish theologians, assume that with the creation of the world, that time was created as well. And scientists pondered the similar question, that time began with the Big Bang. And of course, you ask the question, what was before the Big Bang? And scientists say, well, that's not a sensible question.
Infinite mass and zero space. You can work with that one.
My question is about monotheism. Like everybody seems to agree over here that monotheism started with Judaism. But there is some book, particularly I believe it is Reza Aslan's new book, The Biography of God. And he says even the Pharaoh introduced monotheism, plus Zoroastrians claim that Zoroaster was the first one to introduce monotheism. What is your take on it?
Well, there was the sun god. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I do think that the roots of monotheism, Zoroastrianism, and one of the Egyptian dynasties introduced monotheism. So, could one say that monotheism was in the water in the Middle East?
You know, I think it's accurate to say that these may be precursors of monotheism. Perhaps the great contribution of the Bible is ethical monotheism, is a notion of a God who cares for human beings and cares for this world and expects us to act in an ethical, just manner. That, to my mind, is the unique contribution of Genesis and of the Bible.
No, and some of it is, too, is, with a lot of these figures, they're legendary figures in the sense that we don't have any other evidence besides the text that they existed. So the Zoroastrian question, I get asked this all the time, when does Zoroastrianism begin? Well, it depends on who you ask. There's some Zoroastrians who say, well, Zoroaster lived 5,000 BC. And you're like, well, that's good, except that's 1,000 years before writing was invented. So how do we know that he lived, in 5,000 BC? And others will say, well, he's, 500 BC. And I'm like, okay, that's kind of a range between 5,000 BC and 500 BC, so where do these things fit in? But it's also just even these deeper questions of, and maybe this is for another time, not creation, when did monotheism that happen, but when did humans become religious? At what point do human beings start doing these kinds of rituals that we can identify in interesting ways as being religious? Is it about death things? Is it about burying the dead in particular kinds of ways? Is it doing these kinds of things? What's the correspondence between this and agriculture? Is it agriculture that allows for religion, or is it religion that actually allows for agriculture? Because if you got these people together doing these things, you got to feed them somehow. Really, really interesting, kinds of questions.
There are also, to go with monotheism, there's the term monaltry, which means many God, one is superior, and henotheism, which means the God of this group is superior to this group, and there is another group that has another God that they recognize as superior. So when you define monotheism, you really need to get into the specifics of what it's all about.
And I'm not sure we have really made the breakthrough to monotheism. When people, for example, say, my God, the God I worship, is more powerful, is more true than, for example, the God of Muslims, they're not really monotheists. they implicitly say there must be multiple gods. So I think we haven't even grasped, all of us, what monotheism really is and what an amazingly powerful idea it is and how it should translate into us dealing with each other, if there's one God.
I would remind us of the story in the book of Exodus of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, when Moses comes back from Egypt, and Jethro kind of is catching up on the family news and says, what's new? Well, the God of Israel just took us out. This is very impressive. And the Bible tells us, the book of Exodus, that Jethro then offers sacrifices and offers prayers to the God of Israel, God Elyon, and some Jewish commentators say, oh, this is great. He became a monotheist. He converted to Judaism. He went and had a bris. He had a circumcision, which can't be easy at that age. And no, that's not what he did. He added the God of Israel to his gods. All right? He was a henotheist, right? He multiple gods. So this God's pretty powerful. God brought him out of Egypt, so I'll just add this to my list.
Can't hurt, might help. Thank you all for coming. Please join us for some interfaith cookies. And we'll see you next year.